So I just read a book by Anthony J. It's called Estrogeneration. First of all, I have to tell you, estrogen is bad for you. Number one, for women, it causes much higher rates of breast cancer, cervical cancer, because they're essentially becoming more feminine. Obviously, that's a bad thing for men as well. If you're becoming more feminine, you're all around more feminine. That's a bad thing in and of itself. And then you also have a higher risk for things like breast cancer. Now, let me explain what estrogen is. So estrogen is essentially a note. It's like this instruction manual that is sent through your body, and you have different receptors in your body. So, for example, there's none on your tongue. If you place something estrogenic on your tongue, nothing would happen because there's nothing there capable of reading that instruction manual. Now, within the rest of your body, it's going to be read and interpreted, and it's basically telling your body to become more feminine. So there's something really bad about it, aside from the obvious, which is that the book is called Estrogeneration, and that's not just because this generation has much more exposure to estrogenics, but it's actually because estrogenics have now been found to cross generations. So if you experience a lot of estrogen during your generation, your kids, your grandkids, your great-grandkids will also have more estrogenics, regardless of the amount of estrogenics they come into contact in their lifetime. The estrogenics actually make a mark on your DNA, which that is passed down your DNA with the mark to your kids, and basically that mark tells them to be more feminine and more estrogenic. So, where do all these estrogens come from? These estrogens are actually not human estrogen, but because our receptors don't know the difference, they interpret these things as being human estrogen. Really, they're estrogenics. Some are naturally occurring, such as in foods, and then some are basically unnatural, such as BPA and all sorts of plastics. So he says, food-wise, the number one thing to avoid is flaxseed, and that's by a factor of like 100 to 1. There's no food that's even like 1/100th as bad for you as flaxseed in terms of the amount of estrogenics that it actually contains. After that, you have poppy seeds, and then you have obvious things like soy. And for the food category, it's mostly seeds like that, but those are the big ones. Watch out for soy, especially flaxseed, and sesame seeds as well. So then going into the sort of fragrance category, he says the number one worst fragrance in terms of its oils or its smoke would be lavender. So lavender is the worst there. You want to avoid any products containing lavender. And he actually says that most skincare products do contain not lavender, but all sorts of other estrogenics. So in general, any skincare, fragrance, anything, including especially sunscreen, those are all bad for you because they contain tons of estrogenics. So use sunscreen when you're really going to get burnt and you want to avoid skin cancer, but if you're using it too often, like just to go outside in your backyard, then you are at risk for things like breast cancer instead. So you really have to weigh your options there and not apply it so liberally and without really taking note of what you're going to be doing. If you think you might need it, then you probably don't need it. If you know you're going to need it, then you need it, then you want to use it. The other thing is marijuana smoke. So marijuana smoke, he says, is also pretty much on par with lavender. It's one of the worst things to inhale, estrogen-wise. It contains tons of estrogenics, and obviously you want to avoid that. I feel like a lot of people will have a problem with that one. That's a pretty common one. So aside from those two categories, there are all sorts of things, mostly plastic related. So you want to avoid anything with BPA. That's pretty much well known right now, and most things with BPA are gone. There are all different types of plastics, and they're pretty much all bad for you. If you have to choose a plastic to use, you're going to want to use plastic number 5. It'll just be stamped with a 5 somewhere on the bottle is most likely what you'll be using the plastic for. He also says food, like at the deli, when they have the meat and then they put a sheet of plastic over it. That's bad. Tons of plastic getting in your foods. So that's pretty bad for you right off the bat. You want to eat meat. If you're going to eat meat, you want to eat meat and obviously, if you're not eating meat, you have a ton more to worry about because pretty much everything not meat is covered in soy, pretty much just purely made out of soy a lot of the time. Also, vegetable oil. So vegetable oil is basically a name that was come up with by the vegetable oil companies. Vegetable oil, most of the time, just means soybean oil. So it's basically pure soy. And they call it vegetable oil, number one, because it sounds healthy. Number two, because they don't have to say it's soy. And then number three, because if they run out of soy, they could just use something else and they could still call it vegetable oil. But the majority of the time, the vegetable oil is going to be just pure soy. So avoid all those things. And then the number one way to get rid of the estrogen once it's been in your body is actually to use a sauna. Because when you sweat out the energy, the estrogen. It comes out through your skin with your sweat. So he says, go to a sauna and do that maybe like once a week, and that will help get rid of a lot of the estrogen as well. So avoid all those things, use the sauna, and you should be good. Now, he also talks about in the beginning of the book the effects on animals. So basically the estrogen comes mostly from birth control. So women will take birth control and then they will pee and it goes in the toilet, then it goes into the water system and it's not really filtered out. So they filter it out so that it looks clean and, it is clean aside from the high levels of estrogen. So that estrogen just keeps getting recycled over and over and over. And then all the plastic products, which come into contact with the ocean. And so they look at things like fish and whales, and they find huge levels of estrogen in all of those, even if they're, living thousands of miles from any country. Just in the middle of the ocean, middle of nowhere, they can be 1,000 miles from anyone that's, actively using plastic all the time. And obviously, that's pretty bad. Basically, the whole world is doomed estrogen-wise, but you still want to do your best to be a little bit less doomed. They also talk about how it's mostly in like the Boston area. They're talking about some lakes there, and they said they tested the estrogen levels, and it's just off the charts. And I'm not completely sure about what Alex Jones was talking about. I think he was saying it was like a government thing. But he famously said that the government is turning the frogs gay. And basically this book proves that the frogs are indeed turning gay, but it's because of all of the estrogen. So the levels of estrogen are so high from either pollutants or birth control just being recycled that on much smaller animals and fish, it's extremely apparent, and basically their whole reproduction system is completely destroyed by even a little bit of estrogen. So the frogs are indeed turning gay, and that's killing the frog population as well as a lot of the fish population. It says that the government has been blaming, these small fishermen for, the decreased populations. They're fishing too much. They're catching too many fish. The limit's going to be 6 per season or whatever it is. I don't know. I don't like fishing, but this guy was a fisherman. And he says, no, we're actually not responsible for that. It's actually the fact that the fish are turning gay and the fish are becoming infertile, just as many of the humans are. So estrogens are bad. Estrogens are everywhere. There are certain things to avoid in order to stop increasing your levels of estrogen. You especially want to do that because it's going to last for many hundreds of years throughout your bloodline. And you could also go to a sauna and sweat out a lot of them and avoid a lot of issues. So that's my summary of the book. Don't do estrogen, kids, and see you in the next one.